հայ ժողովրդի սպանեցավ ոչխարներով նման։ Վերջին ակտիվեցան դեսակ հավազանքներ, դեսակ հավազաններ, մեր կողմերում վրագիտներ գտեին թուրքերեն լեզվով գաբրլա յորիը սեզենգելը մերլաτη yaşamasın. İnç erazen.
The history of the Armenians on this strategic plateau in the South Caucasus, between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, at the crossroads between empires, trade routes, and invasions, spanned almost 3,000 years. Successive invaders and land divisions proved more than a match for their independence and inaugurated a tragedy that was to decimate 2/3 of their Anatolian community between 1915 and 1916. World War I had just broken out. From the beginning of the conflict, Turkey saw the opportunity to put an end to European interference in the Ottoman Empire, and especially interference by Russia, which threatened its territorial integrity. Despite the reticence of some of her ministers, 2 of whom were Armenian, the Ottoman government entered the war in November 1914 on the side of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, against the Allies, France, Great Britain, and Russia. Caught in a stranglehold on the new Turco-Russian front in the Caucasus, the Armenians found themselves in the very center of the battlefield. The Ottoman Empire was only barely recovering from its defeats in the Balkan Wars, having lost 85% of her possessions in Europe from 1912 to 1913. The wars in the Balkans shattered European alliances and contributed to triggering the world conflict. This was a government still traumatized by the recent dismemberment of its empire, and the threat that the alliance might give the Armenians their independence reinforced nationalism among some of its members. Preserving the integrity of the empire became a priority, curbing Russian expansionism in the Caucasus an absolute imperative. In January 1915, the Turkish offensive against the Tsar's army ended in disaster. 90,000 Ottoman soldiers were wiped out at Sarıkamış. The Armenians had been mobilized into the ranks of the Ottoman army on a massive scale, but the fact that a handful had joined the Russian volunteer corps served as a pretext for accusing the entire Armenian community of treason. Even so, on February 26, 1915, the war minister and commander of the defeated army, Enver Pasha, wrote to the Armenian Patriarch of Konya.
I take this opportunity to inform you that Ottoman Armenian soldiers conscientiously carried out their duty in the theater of war, something I saw with my own eyes. Therefore, I would be grateful if you could pass on this expression of my satisfaction and gratitude to the Armenian nation, which has always been known for its attachment to the Imperial Ottoman government.
Despite this acknowledgement, and under the pretext of securing the zones on the front, the government ordered Armenian soldiers to be disarmed and assigned to labor battalions. The Germans, allies of the Turks, who had consulates in almost all of the provinces of the empire, approved these measures despite the warning issued by Walter Rössler, the German consul at Aleppo. On April 20th, 1915, he wrote to his ambassador.
All Christian soldiers aged 32 to 45 have been recalled, to be deported certainly. Central government has clearly taken these measures based on false reports from Marash. They follow from an entrenched but nonetheless mistaken view according to which the whole Armenian population is suspect, even hostile. I respectfully request that you intervene to restore the situation.
These prejudices reached a peak in 1915 and marked the stages of the history of the Turkish Armenian people from the end of the 19th century. It all started in the 16th century with the incorporation of Armenia into the Ottoman Empire. At its peak, the empire spread over 3 continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa, with more than 40 million people of 20 or so nationalities. A series of military setbacks in the 17th century, especially its defeat at the gates of Vienna, marked the beginning of the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. Then, in the 19th century, under pressure from Russia, the Ottomans lost part of their territory in the Balkans. Dating from the annexation of eastern Armenia from Persia by the Tsar, the Armenians found themselves the subjects of 2 rival empires. Like all the other non-Muslim minorities in the Ottoman Empire, the Armenians, who are Christians, enjoyed religious and cultural freedoms, but did suffer discrimination and were obliged to pay high taxes. Although they won a certain degree of administrative and internal political autonomy, they were not equal to Muslims under the law. Peasants, for the most part, they created a prosperous society of craftsmen, tradesmen, financiers, architects, doctors, and lawyers in their towns. This bourgeoisie, including some who had even risen to high positions in the service of the government, challenged their status and demanded social and political emancipation with the support of Christian Europe. The Armenian question became a pretext for colonial Europe to interfere in Ottoman affairs. But, like the protection of minorities in general, it would not be allowed to threaten the economic interests of the European powers. From the 19th century onwards, these powers had in fact become the creditors of the Ottoman Empire. Deeply in debt, poorly governed, and plagued by conflict, the empire was in decline. The French and English took control of Ottoman finances, customs revenues, commerce, exploiting the natural resources and road building. There was fierce competition between the French and Germans for railway licenses. The last into the arena, Germany, had wrested the reorganization of the Turkish army, which the Ottoman government undertook to modernize along with the rest of the state and administrative apparatus. living conditions for minorities continued to worsen in spite of the equality promised to all subjects of the empire under the reign of Abdul Hamid II. Against this backdrop, in 1878, as part of the Treaty of Berlin, the West imposed a set of reforms on the Sultan, guaranteeing the security of his Christian and Jewish subjects. The reforms failed to materialize. Groups of Armenian revolutionaries formed a national independence movement in a bid for the community's social and political emancipation. The first revolts, organized against tax inequalities in the traditionally most rebellious provinces, ended in bloody repression. In the period 1894 to 1896, estimates put the number of Armenians massacred with the government's support at between 200 and 250,000. Intended to curb any vestige of separatism, the massacres aroused public indignation in Europe and the ire of politicians and intellectuals alike, such as Jean Jaurès in France and the German pastor Lepsius. Reaction, however, was limited to sharp diplomatic protests. Indignant, the French ambassador in Constantinople, Paul Cambon, denounced French business practices. On October 10, 1895, he wrote in a letter to his mother,
"They have committed atrocities. The Armenians provoked the repression by their protests, but the unrest which followed was abominable. The day before yesterday, at Trebizond, a town of 50,000 souls, the Muslim population rushed the Armenian quarter. The massacre and pillage went on from 10 in the morning until nightfall. It is in France's interest to support Turkey, but we mustn't be taken in. Turkey should be considered as a minor to be kept under European supervision."
1908, Revolution. Officers and liberal Ottomans in exile, known as the Young Turks by Europeans, reacted to the tyrannical policies of the Sultan. They forced the restoration of the constitution abrogated by the Sultan and demanded equality for all subjects of the empire. Minorities entered parliament and the Armenians won 14 seats. Fraternity among communities was the order of the day in the empire, but not for long. In 1909, at the end of a failed counter-revolution, Abdul Hamid II was removed from the throne by the Young Turks and replaced by his brother Mehmet V. In this troubled period, 25,000 Armenians were massacred at Adana, where they had a prosperous economic community enjoying all their new rights. These massacres, involving Young Turks from Cilicia, but mainly perpetrated by the Liberation Army sent by the government the day following the first signs of violence, would sow the seeds of doubt as to the intentions of the Young Turks of the Committee of Union and Progress. As Turkey entered the Great War, their goal became clear. The military wing of the Young Turks aspired to ethnic homogeneity. On November 11, 1914, the Committee of Union and Progress leadership unveiled its plans. The American ambassador to Constantinople, Henry Morgenthau, voiced fears of a new massacre against this backdrop of exacerbated nationalism, fears which were confirmed by his German counterpart, Baron Wangenheim.
As long as Great Britain does not attack the Dardanelles or Turkish ports, there is no cause for worry. If she does, nothing can be guaranteed.
But at that very moment, the English and French were preparing to force a passage through the Bosphorus Straits and the Dardanelles, closed to shipping since the outbreak of hostilities. These straits, long the object of Russian aspirations to access warm waters and which cut them off from their allies, commanded the access to Constantinople. With the capital now threatened, the Turkish government deployed its forces on this new front to save the empire, already endangered by the Russians in the Caucasus. The fighting in this region had created an exodus of thousands of civilians from the onset of winter. In Anatolia's eastern provinces, arrests and deportations of Armenians began under the pretext of securing the borders. In April 1915, in Van, the historic cradle of Armenia, 24,000 Armenians were massacred over 4 days as the Ottoman army fell back from the Russian advance. Survivors took refuge inside the town and organized resistance. After 27 days of fighting, Van was liberated by the Tsar's troops. The defense of Van was described as an insurrection and immediately served as the pretext for a massive roundup in Constantinople during the night of April 24, 1915. More than 600 journalists, writers, lawyers, doctors, architects, deputies, and others were accused of plotting. They were arrested and imprisoned. The majority were deported or executed within a few weeks. These events marked the beginning of massacres and deportations, which would leave between 1 million and 1.5 million dead. The news of government repression immediately spread through the chancelleries of the Western powers. The German ambassador, Baron Wangenheim, continued to approve of what he termed quelling riots. In a telegram written during the month of April 1915, he excludes any intervention and writes,
"In a situation where there is no way out, this could damage interests which are otherwise more important and even crucial for us."
Having lost out in the colonial dividing up of Asia and Africa, Germany had managed to wrench the contract for the Berlin-Constantinople-Baghdad Railroad from the English and French on the eve of the war. 1 month to the day after the May 24, 1915 raid on Constantinople, France, Great Britain, and Russia sent a joint statement to the imperial government in which the term crime against humanity appears for the first time.
In the presence of these new crimes against humanity and civilization committed by Turkey, the Allied governments wish to publicly inform the Sublime Porte that they shall hold all members of the Ottoman government personally responsible for these crimes and their agents who are found to be involved in such massacres.
On June 4th, the imperial power replied in a communique.
It is utterly untrue that massacres of Armenians took place in the empire. If some Armenians had to be displaced, it was because they lived in areas located in the war zones, where their presence, in view of what preceded, gave rise to legitimate defense concerns on the part of the imperial government. Moreover, the Sublime Porte considers it his duty to adopt the measures His Majesty deems necessary to ensure the security of its land and sea borders. Furthermore, the Sublime Porte considers it has no accounts to render to any foreign government.
2 weeks later, Ambassador Wangenheim confided to the German Chancellor.
It is clear that the expulsion of the Armenians is not motivated by military interests alone. The Minister of the Interior, Talat Bey, recently boldly stated to Dr. Mottman, currently serving at the Imperial Embassy, that the Porte wanted to take advantage of the World War to find a radical solution to deal with his enemies at home, the Turkish Christians, without being hampered by foreign diplomatic intervention.
Since no government actually threatened to intervene, there was nothing to prevent the organization of the deportations and the massacres. Talat Pasha, Minister of the Interior, announced a temporary deportation law. Although it makes no specific mention of Armenians, this law nonetheless provided official cover for the current practice, which had gone on since early spring.
Army Corps and division commanders can, if required for military reasons, move the population of towns and villages they suspect of being guilty of treason or espionage, either separately or en masse, and install them in other areas.
Nez dari sarayın arşive mütasarrıfı kovay. Mütasarrıfı evla kardıvarın stav meg anunenis kred. Verçe gelen imza edin. Biz Hüsnü Rıza'yın yani mer hojardan kovay terkibatan. Aileni ke geçikin ku gerta. O jampar. Garkero ve Türkiye'yle hayır ile buneli sinkoliyeti buneli konseketi. Garka çerta. Bak Türkiye'yle gark şovnere Malatya or Hasan se Beratarsan da.
Türkiye'nin etki Hüseyin garki meçen stad Türkiye'nin etki Hosatüsündürler.
Hosatüsün ama German Hosatüsündürler yani hiç.
Aslın adam Türkiye'nin etki Hüseyin. Türkiye'nin gamartsumen falan bu Türkiye'nin luruneyin. Aslın Türkiye'nin etki Hosatüsündürler.
Yani bilirse o Türkiye'nin luruneyin o yani çiz çarpayım.
Hayır.
Ne harbin abi. Türkiye'nin değil urgıdanın.
Sertağın er tergimdan. İlk üç pajnazıyım. Or tun as grupin meçniz.
Ima sen kor as şırçanı. Amen elan. Ya amen mirar bilirsen çe. Amenem Yasin. Bak meg daire gam iz daire.
Posted at one of the empire's most isolated provinces at Karput, the American consul Leslie Davis concentrated his consulate's work on helping the victims and attempted to intervene with the local authorities. On June 30th, 1915, he sent this report to his ambassador.
This is no less than the deportation of the entire Armenian population, not only from this province, but according to my sources, from the 6 provinces comprising Armenia. There are said to be about 60,000 Armenians in this province and about 1 million in the 6 others overall. All of these must be sent into exile, an undertaking greater probably than anything of its kind in history.
The deportations were planned by a secret special organization of the Committee for Union and Progress under the auspices of the Ministry of the Interior. Based in Constantinople, it set up its center of operations at Erzurum, in the heart of eastern Anatolia. Convoys from the north were directed to the transit center at Malatya, and the convoys from the east and southeast to Razulain. The Armenian people of western Anatolia would transit through the Konya and Bozanti camps. The survivors of the mass exodus were gathered in the camps at Alep before being sent to their final destinations, the deserts of Syria and Mesopotamia. Convoys sent out very soon after flyers or town criers announced the deportations. It was only in September 1915 that the government passed a law authorizing the despoilment of property. Kept apart, the men were massacred away from the towns for the most part. Escorted by police, thousands of women, children, and the elderly set out on an exodus stretching several hundreds of miles. On July 11th, 1915, Leslie Davis sent an insistent note to his ambassador.
If it were simply a matter of being obliged to leave here and to go somewhere else, it would not be so bad. But everyone knows it is a case of going to one's death. If there was any doubt about it, it has been removed by the arrival of a number of parties aggregating several thousand people from Erzurum and Erzincan. Almost without exception, they are all ragged, dirty, starving, and sick. And this is no surprise, given the fact that they have been walking for almost 2 months, without being able to change their clothes, without permission to wash or shelter, and with only very little to eat.
Bizde gamushane, vertore asilere. Jandarmenere mego angome, yüksel angome. Amenu kroknere Lazosnere haneti. Eholiye payles ganga hafız tatkire. Hing harul elbet elimart zımbazlar. Amenu dari. Ardın amuz gani getamor malo misal dar eşer araze eşer dari aren desa hero foda san yergar gereva vallahi durmu sero edi aruye çuri aruye ha kaçı on iş desnam verim ver amen mortabat verim ver amen şunu şeyler hin hayırlı genel durumda Maylı siyasanda sangisi belki de hayırlı meşhur.
The deportations were organized in 2 stages and continued from May to July of 1915 in eastern Anatolia, historical Armenia, with systematic massacres. During the following autumn and winter, the Armenians of western Anatolia, who were closer to the railway lines, were in turn loaded onto freight trains. The war had spread to 3 continents, assuring the empire that none of the great powers would intervene. The Franco-British offensive in the Dardanelles turned out to be a disaster for the Allies, who were also losing troops in the trench war on the fronts at Artois and Champagne. Nothing, however, would sway their determination to safeguard their interests in the Ottoman Empire. They secretly negotiated its partition into spheres of influence. The stakes were high, and the Armenian question faded into the distance. Massacres and deportations continued.
Adorus Diyarbakir eşutsink. Amu jogort asan kirenk. Kültür, Türk, klasik. Çocuk gıdaneyin. Hasabın kanıtı gımınmaz. Ancak Franın kılıkın ayrı ya. Aslında Franın kılıkı ayrı leamin. Gımorten, leran bırak gımorten pulurin, var andara gını deyin. Hongını deyin. Ama leç veren kulan, kıporan, rehenna şarkar. Egavası mama isterken, aç çocuğun yalla, hocanın yanına göndereceğiz sizi saz. İş biz, ama kesi panik mi gerta çıplak, kalabalık ileri bırakıp boran gençlü. Asang, leç veren, hazar nero mortetsin, ileri bırak lodayı var. Dagi ayrına asan gerta. Mortabazne. Meçenin sağıl gamına tere dageri. Mama şidisa, iş bes mortetsin. İş bes darin, iş bes verin. Şaderin morta verin. Şader satıcı morta işte. İş besinci mortetsin, çim verir. Elank.
On December 30th, 1915, the American consul Leslie Davis reported to his ambassador.
The term slaughterhouse province, which is how I described Karput in my last report, turned out to be fully justified by what I have learned and seen since then. In fact, it is almost certain that, with the exception of a very small number of those who were deported during the first few days of July, all who left here were massacred before reaching the boundaries of the province.
Powerless to force their governments to react, some consular representatives of neutral countries tried to do something locally. At Trebizond, the American consul Heiser opened the doors of his consulate to children. For his part, the American ambassador Henry Morgenthau relentlessly informed Washington.
These measures were not taken in response to fanaticism or popular protests, but are purely arbitrary. Directed from Constantinople in the name of military necessity, they often take place in districts where there are no military operations. There would appear to be a systematic plan to crush the Armenian race. I spoke on several occasions to the Grand Vizier and pleaded with the Interior and War Ministries to end these persecutions. My efforts are in vain, except here in Constantinople.
Deaf to Washington's appeal, the Austrian and German governments still did not intervene in what they called internal Turkish affairs. 4,200 Armenian survivors took refuge in the mountains. Their signals were picked up by French and British cruisers in the Bay of Antioch. The survivors were rescued and set sail for Port Said in Egypt.
Çur bizaten anlatayım. Zararın bırakımın. İntibarisen. Ait verse köpek kök, campan, yer karları, oraya verse, ben arçeva, hırska kes yakın. Çur. Antat, adeniz, naverunnet kılesreyin, araçın naverunnetten, hayli ahşıkmer, kuysa ahşıkmer, aslı. Asla değil, mezde azadı tarafı boran, din orneri bize, alnın bize paklayın. Gitsakının bize ne? Asan teke mezde azadı tarafı, navarım ne seni renk çürünedir. Hayır canım. Daha tek bakmam. Evet.
The persecution provoked reactions even inside the Young Turks Committee of Union and Progress. Yet, any official refusal to carry out the orders was dismissed. Some civilians did help the Armenians, despite the orders and the risks, especially the Kurds in the Dersim region of the country. The Turkish government was anxious to make sure no evidence remained. Missionaries were refused permission to accompany the convoys. Taking photos was forbidden. Foreign representatives found their correspondence restricted or even censured. With the exception of one of its generals, Liman van Sanders, who successfully opposed the deportation of 25,000 Armenians from Smyrna, Germany played a passive role, despite the repeated appeals from some of its consuls, like Walter Rossler.
More and more bodies are being swept along the Euphrates. This time, they are mainly women and children. Is there nothing that can be done to stop this horror? I beg you to inform the Minister for Foreign Affairs to make sure that the Turkish denials are not published in the German press, which could lead people to believe that Germany approves.
It wasn't until the death of Ambassador Wangenheim in October 1915 that Berlin, fearing accusations of indirect complicity in the crimes of its ally, decided to intervene with the Minister of the Interior through its new ambassador, Wolf Metternich. On July 10, 1916, Metternich bitterly commented,
The Turkish government would not be diverted from its program, the liquidation of the Armenian question by exterminating the Armenian race, not by our admonishments, not by the warnings of the American ambassador or of the apostolic nuncio, nor by the threats of the Allied powers.
Yasa hangini günler ne yapsın? Çöreği çağ. Genelde yasa bizdekan çöreği yazarsa en kes gıhavan yani gıhavan gıhangalan Şimdi de gitmenin sen kınar. Alçıyan. Neden kamen? Hıska geri gasatını yakar. Neden hasat? Voç kiloge voç şatmıyor. Niçe yer çok tevessülü. Fazla geçerse niçe zima değişir. Arap ya Allah Türk'üne de pakar. Kıvaram, gulam, vedancem. Dikine gese bu. Veras gese. Kareli asıcı asızına yakap. Meze asıcı bizim orten yakar. Merveçin kalem ne olur. Kareli asıcı asızına yakap. Mekbizmenin kareli son vakşımına. Mira. Sepay. En çok. Hem kıvaknam, hıskal yer basat ne olur. Arap, acı hatası, peşeriler, Arap, kendileri. Yani anabadi Arap nere. Ve çabuk, hamur nero ve işmar nero, kortero, enzi haskut, kente, tamam bizi tavale, kezi dahes mezi, tamamdır. Bacı, borkanı, kenti.
Thousands and thousands of young women and children were abducted in this way, sold like slaves, or forcibly converted during their deportation. A deportee subdivision was located in the town of Alep, where the convoys regrouped. Crammed together in camps on the banks of the Euphrates, every day Armenians died by the hundreds of hunger, exhaustion, or epidemic. Having survived indescribable suffering and an exodus lasting several weeks, 800,000 Armenians arrived in Syria. Transferred from one camp to another with neither food nor water, they were abandoned to their final destination, the desert sands.
Kınanan, Canfurtuş gelir kınanan, ardın arzıvini o kayları parçaladı, Mart tasaç Anabade. Şaderi adres meral.
Gençler respanesin aslında.
Ya.
Bu şeyin yok.
Kedisi var, çingırlar kaleriydi. Kalan gittiler bargıydı ne. Ardın gelir ne Mart'ka ne Mart'ta dinar arzimlero, kaylero, kazanlero. Aslında biz yaran. Sonra kalene mi kişilerden öğrenci yapalım. Kişiler değil. Kalem, aslında gaylaz deriz ki kılana. Peki, garavanı katile.
In the so-called relocation areas, and especially in the desert of Deir ez-Zor, hundreds of thousands of women and children were exterminated en masse. Some were burned alive in caves. By the end of 1916, 2/3 of the Armenian population of Anatolia had been annihilated. Some 2 years later, on October 30th, 1918, a defeated Turkey signed the Armistice of Mudros with the Allies. Victorious, the French and English entered Constantinople. The young Turk leaders of the Committee of Union and Progress had either fled or were arrested. The new Ottoman government promised they would be judged. On June 3, 1919, Talat, Enver, Cemal Pasha, and their cronies were taken before a court-martial, accused of massacres, plunder, destruction of buildings and bodies by fire, devastation of villages, indecent assault, and torture. On the deportations, the indictment specified that in every region where this law was applied with the most intensity, that is, in the vilayets of the East, all the atrocities were designed and planned by Union and Progress. The verdict, described as historic by the press, was announced on July 5, 1919. It drew up a list of crimes and concluded, "These personal crimes are attributed to the legal entity, the Association of Union and Progress." Talat, Enver, Cemal Pasha, and others were condemned to death in absentia. They were later found and killed by the Armenians. According to the Sykes-Picot Accords, secretly negotiated during the war, the Allies divided up the mandates, giving them power over the Ottoman provinces. Iraq and Palestine went to Great Britain, while Syria, Lebanon, and Cilicia went to France. At the peace conference, the Treaty of Sèvres was signed on August 10, 1920, recognizing the existence of an independent Armenia, uniting the Armenian provinces in the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Caucasus region. It would never be ratified. July 1923, and the creation of the new Turkish Republic of Mustafa Kemal was ratified by the Treaty of Lausanne, burying the Armenian question. By the time the 1927 census was taken, only 65,000 Armenians remained in the new Turkey. Refugees were denied the right to return and dispersed. "600,000 Anatolian Armenians survived the ethnic policy of some of the young Turks, a policy responsible for between 1 and 1.5 million victims. They took refuge in the Caucasus, the Balkans, or in the Arab provinces, or somehow or other, they survived the abductions or deportations. The survivors, thousands of them orphans, made their homes in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and the United States, in Greece, Bulgaria, and France. They are the Armenian diaspora. At the beginning of the century, no word existed to describe massacres and deportations. The jurist Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide in 1944 to describe the Shoah, designating acts committed with the intention of destroying in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. It wasn't until 1948 that the word was incorporated into international law. In the first report written on the Armenian tragedy in 1916, the young English historian Arnold Toynbee wrote that the agony of Armenia had no lack of witnesses. Even if more and more eloquent statistics were available, they could not express the reality of what had happened. A nation had just been exterminated.